So now that we've been talking about all these different pieces and we've seen some code for them and we've seen them in action, before we roll it into the project as a whole, I want to give you a feel for what the big picture of this is. Let's look back at what the filters are and how we're applying them and what they might look like from an object viewpoint. So on the computer we're talking about, and everything in this big purple box on the outside is the computer. We have a file that we're going to read and a file that we're going to write. They theoretically could be the same one, or they could be different out there, depending on the design. But those are on the computer, but external to our Java program. And that's the key thing about this I/O stuff. It's data that is not exclusive to Java. I mean, these files could be read by a C program, a Python program, Microsoft Word, a text editor, Excel, whatever. Actually, there's Java libraries that will help you read those different types of tools. I have one that allows you to read Excel documents and go cell by cell and all that sort of stuff. It's pretty cool, actually. So inside of the orange of our Java program, we have our code and logic. Now, it's up to us to create and deal with all of these different pieces ourselves. At the ends, we have the yellow file objects that represent these files. Now, in our representation of this picture, we have two separate files. So we have a file object that represents these. This file object isn't always created by you, I should say. It's probably created behind the scenes, but sometimes you just pass in a string that represents the file. And other times you actually create the file object. But that file object itself, even if created by us, is not what we're reading and writing from the file. We use a file writer or a file reader or a file input stream or a file output stream, or one of those filter classes that allows us to deal with files in order to be able to read and write files. Now, the reader and writer are text-based. Anytime you see the word reader, think text, characters. Writer, think text, characters, or strings. If you have the stream stuff, think ones and zeros. So if you see input stream, output stream, think ones and zeros, buffered stuff. They can get converted over to these guys because there's a input stream reader and things like that. But that's the default in your mind. That's the vocabulary you want to come up with. Now, the reader and writer objects inside of here is going to depend on how I want to treat these guys. So you can think of this as the buffered reader or the buffered writer inside of there. That's a next level of filter that I'm adding over the top of this stuff. And so the buffered writer gives me the write line mechanism, gives me something that handles the new line. The buffered reader allows me to turn the characters ones and zeros into strings. We may or may not keep track of each level of these. In the code we wrote, the code before the demo, we create the file reader, then we hand that to the buffered reader. We don't have to do it that way. We could just build them as part of the constructor, just link them together as part of the constructor and not track each one individually. We only need to keep track of the one on the outside. But each of these objects interplay, each of these objects play a role in the whole chain of what the I/O sequence is. Now, when we build the component, the idea is to take all of the reader stuff and perhaps all of the writer stuff and wrap them into one piece that deals with files, especially if they're the same type of file that I'm reading and writing. So for each type of file, for each format, most importantly, so if I have a file that writes out multiplication tables, if I have a file that writes out people, if I have a file that writes out products, if I have a file that writes out whatever, the rules for that way that file is designed can be encapsulated into a component, a class, that reads and writes to those rules. So every time I write to a file, I know to put spaces here and commas there and what goes on each line. And then the same rules is put as the reader side of it as well. So remember the roles each of these things play. The file object, java.io.file, is a handler between the operating system and the file that is going to tell Java where that file is, if it exists. It's going to allow us to keep track of it. It's the address book of it all. The file reader and buffered reader objects are giving us the functionality to read in from a file. The file reader allows us to read it in at the character level. The buffered reader allows us to leave us at the line and the string level. The file writer and the buffered writer, same thing on the other side. It allows us to write to a file. The file writer will actually write strings for us because it takes the Java data. It doesn't require us to convert strings into characters. It takes the Java data and allows it to write it as characters. The buffered writer adds into that the new line. Really, the buffered writer is everything file writer does plus a new line character. New line command, I should say, not the character itself. So that's the function and role of these things. The file is the abstract representation. The orange ones inside here are actually reading and writing, and then our code puts it together. This works best when the orange stuff all gets wrapped in some of our code of itself as a component. So our code and logic should be focused around the file. It should be focused around the format of the file. And so that's what we're going to build. We're going to build a component that deals with this file type that we've been talking about. And we're going to take that file type that we've been talking about and then integrate it into our GUI application. And by doing that, we're going to dramatically simplify the pieces, the moving pieces, and hopefully give you a better shot of getting it working quicker. Now, if you're not much of an abstract thinker, if you're very procedural, you like to see lines of code in front of you all at front, this might be a little bit of a stretch for you dealing with these components. That's why I encourage you to follow the demo and build it up a piece at a time and then put it together, all together. This high-level picture is something that, if you're an abstract thinker, might be a great representation. We see this, we can see the pieces, we can see how they interplay. For those of you thinking code, this is probably very fuzzy, bubbly. Where does this tie into code? Well, it does. Let me tell you, it totally does. It's not necessarily apparent, but that's why I'm giving you both views. The high-level view, to be able to see the big picture of what's the representation of this code, how does it get executed, what does it look like when it's running, and then there's the low-level view of what's happening, in the actual individual classes and files. That's also important. So put it all together. Hopefully you're in good shape and you're able to throw together an application that you can type data into, save it in a file, and then read back data from a file and do some processing on.